Absolutely. So, you ready to go on a little adventure with me today?
Always up for an adventure.
All right, excellent. The Church of Tinkerbell podcast.
Faith, imagination, the power of belief.
Love and acceptance to make the world a better place.
What would happen if we all just tried to see the world through the eyes of a child again, even for a moment?
It's a beautiful thought, isn't it?
It is.
The Church of Tinkerbell.
The Church of Tinkerbell. All right, I'm intrigued.
We're going to be looking at a pretty complex topic today. Detransition and the political conversations surrounding it. A really fascinating article from the Church of Tinkerbell. And they're talking about Detrans Awareness Day, part of the bigger picture of trans rights.
Yeah, it's definitely become a hot button issue with strong opinions on both sides.
Absolutely. So our goal today is to explore the facts about detransition, how it's being portrayed, and what the Church of Tinkerbell has to say about it all. First off, though, can we just clarify what detransition actually means?
Of course. Detransition refers to when someone who has transitioned, whether that's socially, medically, or both, makes the choice to stop or partially reverse that process. It's important to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all experience. Some individuals might completely stop all medical interventions, while others might just pause hormone therapy or adjust some aspects of their social transition.
So it's more of a spectrum than a single path.
Got it. Now, the Church of Tinkerbell seems to view this Detrans Awareness Day as a political tactic, mainly by Republicans, to kind of undermine trans rights. They're arguing that the focus on detransition is less about actual support for detransitioners and more about pushing a specific agenda.
That's definitely their perspective, and it's one worth examining. What's interesting is how they approach it. They start by looking at the stats on detransition rates. Seems like they want to ground their stance in the data before getting into the political side of things.
Makes sense. So let's talk numbers. What does the research tell us about how common detransition actually is?
Well, one of the most comprehensive studies we have is the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey. This survey found that only 8% of transgender individuals reported ever detransitioning. And that's a pretty small percentage when you think about it, much lower than the number of people who regret other big life decisions, like getting married or picking a career. 8% is definitely far from the idea that people are constantly regretting transitioning. But you know what's even more interesting is that the survey breaks down that 8% even further. What did they find about the reasons behind these detransitions?
They discovered that a large portion of that 8% was actually temporary detransitions. 62% of those who detransitioned at some point actually ended up going back to identifying as transgender. So that suggests that for a lot of people, detransition isn't a complete rejection of their trans identity, but maybe more like a pause or a change along their journey.
That's fascinating. It really does challenge the assumption that detransition automatically equals regret. So what was behind those temporary detransitions? Was it a change in how they felt about their gender identity?
Surprisingly, no. The survey showed that the main drivers were things like family rejection, financial problems, or even threats to their safety. It's not hard to imagine that in a world that isn't always accepting, some folks might feel forced to conform, even if it means temporarily hiding who they are.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider what the Church of Tinkerbell is saying. They're arguing that it's these societal pressures, not necessarily regret, that are often the main reasons why people detransition. They believe that if we could just lessen those pressures, detransition rates would drop drastically. And they point to the tiny percentage of people who detransitioned because their gender identity changed.
Yeah, the survey found that only 0.4% of people detransitioned because they no longer identified as transgender. That's less than half of 1%. To give you some context, think about common medical procedures like knee replacements or vasectomies. The regret rates for those are actually higher than the percentage of people who detransition because of a change in their gender identity.
That's incredible. It really puts things into perspective. Seems like this narrative about people frequently regretting transitioning is more about perception than reality. But what about the people who do choose to detransition permanently? What do we know about regret, especially after gender-affirming surgery?
That's where it gets even more interesting, because the research shows that regret rates after gender-affirming surgery are super low. In fact, a meta-analysis from 2021, which looked at 27 different studies, found that less than 1% of people regretted having gender-affirming surgery.
Less than 1%. Wow, that's amazingly low. doesn't really line up with a lot of what we hear in the media, does it?
It doesn't, no. And this finding really highlights a crucial point. This idea that transitioning is inherently dangerous and that people often regret it, it just doesn't match up with the evidence. The data clearly shows that most trans individuals who undergo these procedures are happy with their decisions.
So if regret rates are so low, why does this idea of widespread regret persist?
Yeah.
And how does the Church of Tinkerbell see this narrative playing out in the political landscape? Those are some questions we'll be digging into right after this.
In a world where many feel unseen and unheard, there's a place of unconditional acceptance where you belong. The Church of Tinkerbell is building bridges of understanding and creating spaces where diversity isn't just welcomed, it's celebrated. We're a community that stands strong with no religious, political, or financial agenda, just pure dedication to being a voice for the unheard and fostering unity through our beautiful diversity. From LGBTQIA+ rights to racial equality and mental and emotional health, we're having the conversations that matter. Our blogs, podcasts, and resources are here to enlighten, support, and empower. Join the movement where everyone belongs, where your voice matters, and where compassion leads the way. And may Tinkerbell bless you with faith, trust, and a little bit of pixie dust. thechurchoftinkerbell.com.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about how, the research really doesn't back up this common idea that people often regret transitioning. And yet this narrative is still out there. And a lot of times it's being pushed by groups who have their own political goals.
And this brings us right back to what the Church of Tinkerbell is concerned about. How detransition is being used in these political conversations. They're arguing that certain political groups, especially on the right, are using detransition as a way to try and ban gender-affirming care, particularly for young people.
That's right, and they point to a specific tactic that they call cherry-picking data. This basically means that they're only focusing on the small number of detransition cases while ignoring the much larger number of trans individuals who have transitioned and are doing great.
So it's like they're taking a tiny piece of the puzzle and using it to create this misleading picture of the whole thing.
Exactly. They argue that it's a deliberate attempt to distort the reality of being trans and make people afraid and uncertain about transitioning.
You pointed out a good example of this in the article. It talked about how some groups are using individual detransitioners as proof that gender-affirming care is harmful, even though their experiences aren't really representative of the whole trans community.
Yeah, absolutely. And this ties into another thing they highlight, kind of blurring the lines between detransition and regret. Because not everyone who detransitions does it because they regret transitioning. We talked earlier about how a lot of people detransition because of external pressures like family rejection or discrimination.
But by presenting all detransitions as cases of regret, it makes it seem like transitioning is inherently risky and likely to lead to unhappiness.
Exactly. It feeds into this idea that transitioning is some kind of dangerous experiment, especially when it comes to young people.
And that's where you hear the protect the children rhetoric come in. The argument often frames trans youth as too young to understand their gender identity and needing protection from transitioning.
Right. And by connecting this rhetoric to detransition, it creates the sense of urgency and fear, making it seem like these bans on gender-affirming care are necessary to, protect kids.
But as we've seen, the research doesn't support that at all. Detransition rates are low for all age groups, and regret after gender-affirming care is even lower. Seems like this argument is more about ideology than actual evidence.
The Church of Tinkerbell sees it as a calculated strategy. They believe that by tapping into this really strong instinct to protect children, these groups can gain support for policies that actually limit the rights of trans youth.
It is a very effective tactic because it plays on people's emotions and worries, even if those emotions aren't really based in reality.
And it can have very real consequences. We're seeing all these new laws popping up across the country that are trying to limit access to gender-affirming care for minors, and a lot of it is based on these misleading narratives about detransition and regret.
So we're seeing how these political tactics, these ways of talking about detransition, are being used to support discriminatory policies. But what are the ethical implications here? Is it okay to use a small group of people's experiences to push an agenda that could hurt an entire community?
That's a question the Church of Tinkerbell is really grappling with. One of their biggest worries is that this focus on detransition, this way of portraying it as a widespread problem, is creating this atmosphere of fear and distrust around trans identities in general.
So it's not just about detransition itself, but about the bigger message it's sending.
Exactly. It creates this idea that being transgender is inherently risky, that you're probably going to regret it, that it's something to be afraid of rather than embraced. And that can be so harmful to transgender people, especially young people who are already trying to navigate a world that isn't always accepting.
It could make them question their own identities, feel ashamed of who they are, and hesitate to reach out for help.
Precisely. The Church of Tinkerbell is worried that this climate of fear could lead to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and even suicide among trans youth because they feel increasingly isolated and without support.
It's really sad to think that these political moves could have such a big impact on people's lives. But the Church of Tinkerbell doesn't just focus on the problems. They also offer solutions. What do they think we should do to counteract these harmful narratives and create a more supportive place for all trans people?
They're advocating for a kind of multifaceted approach that involves education, advocacy, and a real fundamental shift in how we view trans identities. One of their main suggestions is to really focus on the root causes of detransition, especially those external pressures that force individuals to make choices that might not be true to who they are.
So instead of trying to limit access to gender-affirming care, we should be focusing on fixing the problems in society that contribute to detransition in the first place.
Exactly. They believe that if we can make a world where trans people are truly accepted, supported, and affirmed in their identities, the need for detransition would probably go down significantly. This means dealing with things like transphobia, discrimination, and the lack of resources and support.
It's about creating a culture where being trans isn't seen as something that needs fixing, but simply another way of being human.
Precisely. They also really stress the importance of making sure people have accurate information about trans identities in healthcare. This means challenging false information, teaching the public about the realities of transitioning and detransitioning, and making sure healthcare providers are able to provide sensitive and informed care to trans people.
So basically fighting ignorance with knowledge and empathy.
Yeah, and in the end, it's about creating a world where trans people feel like they can make their own choices without fear of judgment or discrimination.
This has been a really eye-opening discussion. We've looked at the facts about detransition, how it's being used in political discussions, and the ethics of those tactics. But there's still a lot more to uncover. In the final part we'll be going deeper into the Church of Tinkerbell's suggestions and discussing how we can all help create a fairer and more equal world for transgender individuals. Okay, so we've talked about all the complexities of detransition and how it's being used in these political debates. Now, I think it's time to shift gears a little and focus on solutions. In the materials you sent, you highlighted the Church of Tinkerbell's call to action, and I'd love to hear more about their proposals.
Well, they advocate for a really multi-pronged approach, like they're trying to tackle this from all angles. And at the core of their argument is this idea that we need to shift the conversation away from restriction and towards real, genuine support for trans people. They believe that instead of trying to limit access to gender-affirming care, we should be focusing on creating a world where trans people feel safe, accepted, and empowered to make choices that really resonate with who they are.
So basically, instead of reacting with fear and trying to control what people choose, we should be proactive in building a more inclusive and supportive environment.
Exactly. And this means addressing the root causes of the problems that trans folks face, especially those societal pressures that can lead to detransition. The Church of Tinkerbell argues that if we can build a society where trans people don't have to constantly fear rejection or discrimination or violence, then we'll probably see a decrease in the need for detransition.
That makes sense. It's about removing the barriers that force people into making choices that they wouldn't necessarily make otherwise.
Right. It's about creating a world where being trans isn't seen as some kind of problem to fix, but just another normal part of the human experience.
So how do we actually get there? What are some specific actions that they recommend?
Well, one big area they focus on is education. They really emphasize how important it is to get accurate information out there about transgender identities and healthcare. They want to fight back against all the misinformation and make sure that people actually understand what transitioning and detransitioning are really about.
So it's about replacing all that fear and prejudice with knowledge and understanding.
Exactly. And education isn't just for the general public either. They also want to make sure that healthcare providers are trained to provide culturally competent and informed care to trans people.
So making sure trans folks feel safe and respected when they're seeking medical care.
Absolutely. They believe that when trans individuals have access to really supportive and affirming healthcare, they're more likely to make choices that are genuinely right for them, which can reduce the chances of regret or detransition later on.
It sounds like they're also calling for a bigger cultural shift in how we view gender as a whole.
Oh, definitely. They're really pushing for a move away from this strict idea of male and female, They want us to embrace a more inclusive and expansive view of gender that recognizes all the different ways people experience it.
So it's about acknowledging that gender isn't always simple or black and white, and that there's no single right way to be trans.
Exactly. And they also challenge this medical model of transness that we often see, which basically frames trans identities as some kind of illness or disorder that needs to be fixed. Instead, they're advocating for a more affirming model that sees trans identities as just a normal variation of human experience.
So it's about respecting people's autonomy and trusting them to make their own decisions about their bodies and identities.
Right. They believe that this change in perspective is crucial for creating a society where trans people feel truly valued and respected rather than marginalized or pathologized.
And in the end, it's about building a world where everyone can be themselves, regardless of their gender identity.
That's really the heart of their message. They believe that everyone deserves to live without fear, without discrimination, without violence, and they're dedicated to working towards a future where that becomes a reality for all trans individuals.
This has really given us a lot to think about. We've explored the facts about detransition, how it's being used in political discussions, and the ethics of those tactics.
But like the Church of Tinkerbell reminds us, we don't have to let those narratives control the conversation. We can choose to focus on solutions, on creating a world where trans people feel safe, supported, and empowered to truly live their lives.
And I think that's something we can all contribute to in our own ways, whether it's educating ourselves and others, challenging those harmful stereotypes, or supporting policies that protect transgender rights. There are so many ways to help create a more just and equitable world.
The Church of Tinkerbell really wants us to listen to trans voices, believe their stories, and support their efforts to advocate for themselves and their communities. They remind us that real progress requires understanding, compassion, and a willingness to question the way things are.
So as we wrap up, let's keep that in mind. Let's commit to being allies, to fighting for trans rights, and to working towards a future where everyone, no matter their gender identity, has the chance to thrive.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration. We hope it's made you curious and inspired you to learn more and stay engaged in these really crucial conversations.
And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep fighting for a fairer and more just world for everyone. And listener, keep sprinkling that fairy dust, all right? We'll see you next time.